You think you know America, but Nebraska has been hiding secrets so dumb, so bizarre, and so shockingly real that historians still can't explain half of them. A town with one person who is also the mayor, the bartender, and the librarian. A state that literally rained fish on an entire town. A sandwich you have eaten your whole life that was born at a poker game in the middle of the Midwest. Kool-Aid, yes, that Kool-Aid, invented right here. And a US president who technically called Nebraska home for exactly 16 days. We found 71 of these wild, embarrassing, and mind-blowing facts, and we are dumping every single one on you right now. And I promise by number 10, you will be texting someone. If this video already has your brain doing backflips, smash that hype button right now, and let's blow Nebraska's cover wide open. Because the algorithm needs to see this, and so does everyone you know. 1. Nebraska is the only state in all of America running on a single-house legislature, and every other 49 states have been watching with jealousy since 1937, trying to copy the same system with absolutely zero success. While the rest of the country runs 2 chambers, arguing with themselves like a bad family dinner, Nebraska just sends 49 senators into one room, gets the job done, and walks out. 49 senators chosen specifically because that odd number makes a tie vote mathematically impossible. Nebraska basically built a cheat code directly into its own government structure. 2. Kool-Aid. The drink every American child has spilled on a white shirt at least once in their life was born in Hastings, Nebraska in 1927. Edwin Perkins mixed up this sugary revolution in a state most Americans genuinely forget exists on the map. The drink became so iconic, it is now officially Nebraska's state soft drink, which means Nebraska had to pass an actual law to honor fruit-flavored sugar water. The birthplace of one of America's most recognizable beverages sits quietly in a town that most people cannot point to without Googling it first. 3. Nebraska's state capitol building looks like someone dared an architect to design the world's most confusing government structure, and he absolutely delivered. Instead of a traditional dome like every other state capitol in America, Nebraska went with a skyscraper tower shooting straight into the sky. The result was so architecturally bizarre that locals gave it a nickname that cannot be repeated in polite company but involves the word plains. The nickname stuck permanently, and today Nebraska's own residents casually use it while giving out-of-town guests directions to the building. 4. Monowi, Nebraska had exactly one legal resident, and her name was Elsie Eiler. Elsie was not just living alone in a ghost town, she was simultaneously the mayor, the bartender, the librarian, the town clerk, and the treasurer all by herself. In every single year, Elsie sat down and issued herself her own official liquor license because the law required it, and nobody else was available to sign the paperwork. One woman ran an entire American municipality like a one-person government show, and the state of Nebraska just let it happen without blinking. 5. Malcolm X. One of the most powerful and transformative voices in all of American civil rights history, was born in Omaha, Nebraska in 1925. The man who would shake the entire nation and challenge its deepest systems of racial injustice came from a state that almost never gets mentioned in the same sentence as his legacy. Nebraska schools barely teach it. Nebraska tourism barely promotes it. And most Americans hearing this fact right now are currently questioning everything they thought they knew about where important people come from. R6. Nebraska's Sandhills region is the largest stabilized sand dune system in the entire Western Hemisphere, covering nearly 19,300 square miles of ancient rolling dunes. That is larger than the entire state of West Virginia, sitting right in the middle of America, completely hidden in plain sight. Most people hear Nebraska and picture flat cornfields stretching endlessly into a boring horizon. But underneath that image is a massive ancient dune landscape that scientists travel from across the world specifically to study. The cornfield stereotype has been doing Nebraska dirty for decades. 7. Standing Bear was a Ponca chief who walked into a federal courtroom in Omaha, Nebraska in 1879 and had to legally argue that he was a human being. The judge ruled in his favor, making it the first time in American history that a federal court recognized Native Americans as legal persons with rights under United States law. This landmark moment of basic human dignity was won right there in Nebraska, and somehow it barely appears in mainstream American history textbooks or classroom discussions anywhere across the country. 8. Nebraska was rushed into statehood in 1867, in one of the most chaotic political moments in American history. Congress approved statehood. President Andrew Johnson immediately vetoed it, and then Congress turned around and overrode that veto in rapid succession like a legislative ping-pong match, happening at full speed. Nebraska essentially fought its way into the Union through pure political stubbornness, while a presidential veto sat crumpled on the floor. Most states just got admitted quietly, but Nebraska had to make the entire thing dramatically complicated from the very beginning. 9. Nebraska's highest point is called Panorama Point, standing at 5,424 feet above sea level. And it is so flat and unremarkable that tourists regularly drive directly past it without realizing they have just reached the summit. There is no dramatic peak, no breathtaking cliff, no moment of achievement waiting at the top. Just a gentle grassy rise that looks almost identical to every other grassy rise surrounding it. Nebraska technically has a highest point, but it requires a GPS device and a strong imagination to feel even slightly impressed upon arrival. 10. Why Nebraska grows enough corn annually to wrap around the entire Earth multiple times, and yet the state ranks remarkably low in corn consumption among its own residents. Nebraska is essentially growing a mountain of corn every single season and then shipping it somewhere else, while Nebraskans reportedly eat relatively normal amounts of the stuff like everyone else. The state that defines itself by corn, in its nickname, its culture, and its landscape, is quietly not even eating what it grows, which is either deeply ironic or the most Nebraska thing imaginable. 11. The worst grasshopper plague in all of American history descended on Nebraska in 1874, and it was not just an inconvenience, it was a biblical-level catastrophe. Locusts arrived in numbers so massive they physically blocked out the sun, turning afternoon into darkness across entire counties. The swarms were so thick they piled onto railroad tracks, making the rails too slippery for trains to move, and then started eating wooden tool handles straight out of farmers' hands. The grasshoppers essentially declared war on an entire state and briefly won. 12. The Platte River running through Nebraska is famously described as a mile wide and an inch deep, making it one of the most spectacularly useless rivers for actual navigation in all of American history. Boats could not travel it meaningfully, cargo could not float down it efficiently, and yet this shallow wandering ribbon of water guided literally the entire westward migration of America across the continent. Hundreds of thousands of pioneers followed a river that was essentially too shallow to swim in, and somehow that plan worked completely. 13. The College World Series has been played in Omaha since 1950, making a completely landlocked Midwestern city the permanent, undisputed capital of college baseball for over 70 consecutive years. No coastal city, no baseball hotbed, no traditionally sporty metropolitan area claimed this title. Omaha did. A city sitting in the middle of America surrounded by cornfields became the annual destination where college baseball crowns its champion every single summer and has done so longer than most Americans have been alive. 14. Nebraska's first territorial governor showed up to his new capital city ready to govern and found absolutely nothing waiting for him. See, no government buildings, no official offices, no infrastructure of any kind, just open land and ambitious plans on paper. He governed the Nebraska territory from a tent for weeks, while construction crews built the actual Capitol building around the idea of a functioning government. The man tasked with running an entire territory had to do it from camping equipment while waiting for someone to finish the walls. 15. Nebraska's ashfall fossil beds contain animals that died standing completely upright 12 million years ago, buried alive in volcanic ash from a massive eruption that originated in Idaho. Rhinoceroses, horses, and camels were preserved exactly where they collapsed mid-stride, creating a frozen mass death scene that scientists can walk through today. The ash traveled over 1,000 miles from its source and killed everything it settled on so thoroughly that the animals were preserved in 3 dimensions, still standing in their final moments of panic. 16. The town of Niobrara, Nebraska, has been physically relocated not once but twice because the Missouri River kept flooding and destroying everything residents built. The entire town picked up its buildings and moved to higher ground. Then, the river found them again and flooded the second location too. An entire American community kept getting chased by a river across the landscape, like the water had a personal grudge against the town specifically. After the second relocation, residents reportedly just accepted that the river was going to do whatever it wanted. 17. The Reuben sandwich, one of the most beloved deli sandwiches in all of American food culture, was reportedly created at a poker game inside Omaha's Blackstone Hotel around 1925. The sandwich won a national competition in 1956 with documentation solid enough to settle the argument against competing origin claims from New York. A sandwich that millions of Americans eat weekly at diners and delis across the country was born not in a big city food scene but at a card table in Nebraska during a late-night poker hand. 18. Crazy Horse. One of the most iconic and legendary figures in all of Native American and American history was killed. Not in the Dakotas, where most people instinctively assume, but at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. Say, the man whose name appears on mountains, whose face appears on currency proposals, and whose legacy fills entire history books, drew his last breath on Nebraska soil. This is the kind of historical fact that completely reorders how people imagine the geography of American history, and Nebraska gets essentially zero acknowledgement for it. 19. Chimney Rock was the single most mentioned landmark in pioneer diaries written across every major westward trail in American history. Travelers wrote about it, obsessively described it in letters, home-sketched it in journals, and used it as the psychological milestone marking real progress toward the West. More American pioneers wrote about this one rock formation than almost any other single landmark on the entire journey, and yet it barely appears in standard American school curricula. The most documented rock in frontier history sits quietly in Nebraska, getting almost no credit. 20. After World War I, Nebraska passed a law banning the teaching of foreign languages in public schools, treating multilingualism like a threat to national identity. A teacher named Robert Meyer taught a child to read in German and got arrested for it. The case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, which struck the law down in 1923 in a ruling that became a foundational precedent for American educational freedom. Nebraska accidentally created one of the most important free speech rulings in constitutional history by trying to stop a man from teaching a 10-year-old German. 21. Arthur County, Nebraska, governs a territory larger than some entire nations on Earth, and does it with a population smaller than most apartment buildings in New York City. Roughly 500 people spread across an enormous stretch of land, hold county elections, appoint officials, maintain roads, and run a functioning American government with the kind of staffing numbers that would embarrass a small restaurant. Every election in Arthur County is essentially a neighborhood vote, where there is a reasonable chance the candidate and the voter are related to each other. 22. Nebraska has more total miles of river running through it than any other state in the continental United States, and yet spent decades locked in bitter legal water shortage disputes with its own neighboring states. A state sitting on top of one of the largest underground freshwater reserves in the entire world, with rivers crossing it in every direction, was simultaneously arguing in court that it did not have enough water. Nebraska has so much water underneath it and around it that running out should be mathematically impossible. And yet the drought emergencies kept getting declared anyway. 23. Warren Buffett, one of the wealthiest human beings in the recorded history of money, still lives in the same Omaha house he purchased in 1958 for $31,500. The man who built a financial empire that influences global markets daily wakes up every morning in a modest house, in a state most people associate with corn and football and not much else. Buffett could live anywhere on the planet and has chosen Nebraska every single day for over 60 consecutive years, which is either deeply humble or deeply stubborn depending on perspective. 24. Nebraska's first state penitentiary had a construction crew with a very unique employment situation, because the prisoners themselves built their own prison walls with their own hands. The state handed convicts tools, materials, and instructions, and watched them construct the very facility designed to contain them. There is a particular kind of philosophical irony in asking men to build their own cage that, apparently, nobody in Nebraska's early government stopped to think too hard about. The prison got built, the convicts moved in, and everyone involved just continued on with their day. 25. Nebraska farmers regularly pull shark teeth out of their soil while plowing fields and planting crops, because the entire state was once the floor of a massive inland sea that covered the middle of America millions of years ago. A landlocked state sitting hundreds of miles from any ocean is quietly full of ocean fossils hiding just beneath the surface of its cornfields. Farmers in Nebraska have found so many shark teeth that finding one has reportedly become more of a mild curiosity than an exciting discovery on most family farms across the state. 26. A Nebraska town named Worms has existed proudly since the 1870s and has refused to change its name through over a century of national mockery jokes and unsolicited opinions from outsiders. The residents of Worms, Nebraska, have sat through generations of punchlines, endured every possible worm-related comment imaginable, and responded each time by simply not changing anything. The town sign still reads Worms. The post office still stamps Worms on every letter, and the people living there have apparently decided that outlasting the mockery is a more satisfying response than surrendering to it. 27. The Transcontinental Union Pacific Railroad, the iron spine that physically connected America from coast to coast for the first time in history, was heavily lobbied, financed, and pushed through political channels by Nebraska interests. The railroad that transformed American commerce, travel, and expansion, and that every history textbook credits as a national achievement, was essentially a Nebraska political project behind the scenes. Nebraska got the railroad built, America got connected, and then history books managed to tell that entire story without putting Nebraska anywhere near the center of it. 28. Doc Middleton was Nebraska's most celebrated outlaw, carrying the legendary title of King of the Horse Thieves across the frontier, and he was born in Texas. Nebraska's own most famous criminal was not even from Nebraska. The state that claimed this outlaw as part of its Wild West identity imported him from somewhere else entirely, and then built local mythology around a man who had no Nebraska origins whatsoever. Nebraska could not produce its own homegrown legendary criminal, and had to borrow one from Texas, which somehow made the legend more popular, not less. 29. Nebraska produces more popcorn than any other state in America, making it the undisputed snack capital of every movie theater in the country. And yet Nebraska has virtually no movie industry of its own. The state feeding the nation's film-watching habit with its signature snack has almost no connection to the actual business of making films. Every time an American sits in a dark theater watching a blockbuster and reaches into a bucket of popcorn, there is a reasonable chance that popcorn grew in a Nebraska field tended by someone who has probably never been to Hollywood. 30. Nebraska is one of only 2 states in America that splits its electoral college votes by congressional district, instead of awarding them all to one candidate. And in 2008, that single-split electoral vote became nationally significant. Nebraska's 2nd congressional district sent one electoral vote to Barack Obama, making it a small but real piece of his historic victory, while the rest of the state voted the other direction. A state famous for being politically predictable quietly delivered a genuinely dramatic electoral moment that political analysts talked about for years afterward. 31. A federally operated Native American boarding school ran for decades in Genoa, Nebraska, where thousands of indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and brought in to have their languages, cultures, and identities systematically erased through forced assimilation programs. Children arrived speaking their native languages and left speaking only English, having been punished for any connection to their own heritage. And this institution operated openly with full government backing for years, and yet it appears in almost no mainstream American history education, leaving an enormous and deliberately uncomfortable chapter of Nebraska history sitting largely unexamined. 32. The Niobrara River flowing through Nebraska has been officially designated a National Scenic River by the federal government, placing it among America's most beautiful and protected waterways. A state that the entire country stereotypes as scenically barren, flat, and visually uninteresting, is home to a federally recognized gorgeous river corridor that draws kayakers, hikers, and nature lovers from across the nation every summer. See, Nebraska has been losing a geography argument with the rest of America for decades, while quietly containing some of the most stunning natural landscapes the Midwest has to offer. 33. Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom television program introduced an entire generation of Americans to wildlife documentary storytelling, and essentially created the template for nature television as a genre. The show that taught millions of families what a wildebeest looked like and why lions were terrifying was produced out of an insurance company headquartered in a cornfield state. Nature documentary culture. As Americans know, it was born not from National Geographic headquarters or a coastal media empire, but from an Omaha insurance office that apparently decided selling policies and filming cheetahs were compatible business activities. 34. Nebraska's original state capitol building literally sank into the ground because the foundation underneath it failed, and the structure began physically descending into the earth like a very slow governmental disaster. The replacement capitol, the famous skyscraper tower that locals gave an unprintable nickname, was built several blocks away on a properly engineered foundation, so the same embarrassing situation would not repeat itself. Nebraska's government built one capitol, watched it sink into the dirt, and then built an entirely different shaped building elsewhere, which explains a lot about why the replacement looks like nothing else in American civic architecture. 35. Nebraska's Toadstool Geologic Park contains rock formations so alien and otherworldly in appearance that NASA scientists chose it specifically to test Mars rover equipment on American soil before sending the machines to another planet. The landscape looks so much like the Martian surface that it served as a legitimate stand-in for outer space during equipment trials. A stretch of Nebraska Badlands was considered close enough to Mars that the people responsible for interplanetary exploration decided it was the best available option on Earth, which is either a tremendous compliment to Nebraska or a concerning statement about Mars. 36. A Nebraska town named Funk has existed since 1887 and has never once in its entire history seriously considered changing its name despite having over a century of opportunities to do so. The town of Funk, Nebraska has watched naming trends come and go, seen words rise and fall in cultural meaning, and responded to all of it by simply remaining Funk without apology or hesitation. Every piece of official mail, every government document, and every road sign in the surrounding area has confirmed the town's name for over 100 years, and the residents appear completely unbothered by all of it. 37. Arbor Day. The tree planting holiday, now celebrated across all 50 American states and observed in multiple countries around the world, was invented in Nebraska City, Nebraska in 1872. The holiday, dedicated to planting and appreciating trees, was created in one of the least naturally forested states in America by a man named Julius Sterling Morton, who looked at the treeless Nebraska prairie and decided the appropriate response was to invent an entire holiday around fixing it. Nebraska gave the world a tree holiday from a place that barely had any trees, which is either inspiring or deeply ironic. 38. Nebraska's population has remained essentially flat for over 60 consecutive years, while every single one of its neighboring states grew significantly in population during that same period. People moved to Colorado, people moved to Iowa, people moved to Kansas and Missouri, and the numbers reflect it clearly in every census report. Soft Nebraska sits in the middle of all that regional growth, completely stationary, like a geographic island of demographic stubbornness, surrounded by states that figured out how to attract and keep residents. The state has been losing the population argument with its neighbors for 6 straight decades. 39. Nebraska's soybean crop is so enormous that it directly influences global commodity pricing on international markets, making a state most people associate exclusively with corn a quiet but powerful force in worldwide food economics. Traders in Tokyo and London watch Nebraska soybean harvest reports and adjust their positions accordingly because the numbers matter at a scale that reaches far beyond American borders. The state that cannot convince people to stay within its own borders is simultaneously moving international financial markets from the middle of the country without most of the world realizing where the numbers are coming from. 40. Nebraska's unicameral legislature holds 2 separate distinctions that no other state legislature in America can claim simultaneously. It is the only single-chamber legislature in the country, and it is also the only completely nonpartisan state legislature anywhere in the United States, meaning no party labels appear on any candidate's ballot during elections. Saw Nebraska voters choose their state senators without knowing their official party affiliation, which is either a remarkably pure expression of issue-based democracy or a deeply confusing experience depending entirely on how strongly a voter feels about political labels appearing on their ballot. 41. The deadliest blizzard in Nebraska history arrived in January 1888, And its cruelest timing was that it struck in the afternoon while children were still inside their schoolhouses across the state. Teachers made the decision to send students home, and the storm consumed them on the walk back with temperatures dropping and visibility disappearing in minutes. So many children died on that short walk between school and home that the storm was renamed nationally and is still remembered as the School Children's Storm. A single afternoon weather decision turned a routine school day into one of America's deadliest weather tragedies. 42. Chimney Rock. The single most documented landmark in all of American pioneer history is actively eroding, and scientists estimate that within a few centuries it will be almost entirely gone from the landscape. The rock formation that hundreds of thousands of westward travelers wrote about, sketched in journals, and used as their primary psychological milestone is slowly disappearing from the Nebraska skyline, piece by piece every year. A landmark that shaped the emotional geography of an entire national migration is heading toward extinction, while most Americans remain completely unaware it is vanishing and equally unaware it exists in the first place. 43. Nebraska's Highway 2. Cutting through the Sandhills region has been named one of the greatest road trips in all of America by travel writers and outdoor enthusiasts who discovered it largely by accident. The drive winds through rolling ancient dunes past isolated ranches and under enormous open skies in a state that the entire country routinely skips on the way to somewhere more famous. Nebraska has one of America's most celebrated scenic drives sitting inside its borders and still cannot convince the average American road tripper to consider it a destination rather than an inconvenient stretch of interstate to survive. 44. A Nebraska railroad line collapsed financially in the late 1800s mid-operation, and the trains simply stopped running at whatever point along the route the money ran out, leaving an incomplete rail line frozen in place. The tracks ended at a random midpoint in the landscape, not at a station, not at a planned terminus, but wherever the financial collapse caught up with the project. Passengers and freight that needed to continue their journey past that point had to find alternative arrangements because the railroad just stopped existing at a completely arbitrary location and never resumed operations on that stretch again. 45. The Valentine region of Nebraska contains the densest concentration of Ice Age megafauna fossils found anywhere in all of North America, with woolly mammoths, giant camels, and prehistoric bears all dying in massive numbers across this specific stretch of landscape millions of years ago. Scientists excavating this region have found so many large prehistoric animal remains that it has become one of the most significant paleontological sites on the entire continent. A small Nebraska town most Americans have never heard of sits on top of what is essentially the world's most impressive ancient animal graveyard, hiding just below the surface. 46. Grand Island, Nebraska was named by French fur traders who encountered a nearby river island and were genuinely impressed enough by its size to name their settlement after it. The island has since completely washed away, eroded entirely by the river that created it, over a century ago, leaving nothing behind to justify the name. The city kept the name anyway, continued growing, continued putting Grand Island, Nebraska on every piece of correspondence and official document, and nobody in the intervening century has seriously proposed updating the city's identity to reflect the fact that the Grand Island it was named after no longer exists. 47. Warren Buffett's entire investment philosophy, the framework that influenced global financial thinking for decades and made him one of the most studied business minds in human history, was developed and refined while he was sitting in a modest house in Omaha, Nebraska. See, the strategy that Wall Street analysts wrote books about, that business schools built entire curricula around, and that investors worldwide tried to reverse engineer and replicate, was not shaped in a Manhattan boardroom or a Silicon Valley office. It came from a man thinking quietly in the middle of America's most overlooked state, while his neighbors went about completely ordinary Nebraska lives around him. 48. Standing Bear's 1879 federal court victory in Omaha was the first ruling in American legal history to establish that Native Americans are human beings with enforceable rights under United States law, meaning this basic recognition of humanity had to be argued for and won in a courtroom rather than simply assumed. Judge Elmer Dundy wrote that a human being is a human being regardless of race and that the law applies accordingly. That sentence had to be written by a federal judge in Nebraska in 1879 because it was not yet considered settled fact anywhere in American law before that moment. 49. Nebraska has over 90,000 miles of rivers and streams running through it, which is more total river mileage than Texas, despite Texas being nearly 3 times larger in total land area. The state that loses every size comparison to Texas and accepts that loss as simply factual reality quietly beats its enormous neighbor on one specific and deeply satisfying metric that Nebraskans apparently do not advertise nearly enough. More water moves through Nebraska's landscape than through a state so large it contains multiple climate zones and its own international border, which suggests Nebraska's geography is considerably more dramatic than its reputation communicates. 50. The Meyer versus Nebraska. Supreme Court ruling of 1923 did not simply end the state's foreign language teaching ban. It created a constitutional precedent establishing that Americans have a fundamental right to teach and learn any subject they choose free from government interference. A Nebraska law designed to suppress immigrant culture accidentally handed American education one of its most important legal protections. So every private school, every language class, every unconventional curriculum operating freely in America today exists partly under the legal umbrella that Nebraska's overcorrecting post-war legislature accidentally created by arresting a teacher for explaining German to a child. 51. A tornado touched down near Minden, Nebraska in 1956, and did something so strange that when residents reported it, the government felt compelled to officially verify and document the event before anyone would believe it. The tornado passed over a nearby pond, sucked the water and everything living inside it directly into the air, and then rained live fish down onto the town below. People walked outside after the storm passed and found fish scattered across their yards, their rooftops, and their streets. A verified government-documented rain of actual fish fell on a Nebraska town, and it still sounds completely made up. 52. The sand hills of Nebraska cover nearly a quarter of the entire state, spanning 19,300 square miles of ancient stabilized sand dunes that most Americans have never heard of and would not believe existed in Nebraska if shown on a map. That single region of Nebraska is larger than the entire state of West Virginia, sitting unannounced and largely uncelebrated inside a state the country already underestimates. Nebraska contains a geographic feature larger than an entire American state within its own borders, and has somehow failed to make this fact a central part of how it introduces itself to the rest of the country. 53. The Omaha World Herald newspaper won a Pulitzer Prize in 1943 for running a campaign that encouraged Americans to donate scrap metal to support the war effort during World War II. The campaign generated enormous amounts of donated material that fed directly into military manufacturing at a critical moment in the conflict. A Nebraska newspaper shaped the way an entire nation participated in funding its own wartime survival and collected one of journalism's highest honors for doing it. The story of how America sourced its wartime materials runs directly through an Omaha newsroom that most American journalism histories barely mention. 54. Nebraska spent years in legal battles during the 1890s, trying to claim disputed land along the Missouri River that kept physically moving because rivers do not respect property boundaries drawn on maps. The river shifted its course over time, leaving pieces of land stranded on the wrong side of the state line, and triggering border disputes that courts had to resolve with the legal equivalent of a very confused shrug. Two states argued for decades over who owned a piece of land that a river had accidentally relocated, and Nebraska participated in this geographic confusion with complete bureaucratic seriousness throughout the entire ordeal. 55. Nebraska's official state fossil is the woolly mammoth because mammoth remains turn up so regularly on Nebraska farms and construction sites that they have essentially become routine agricultural discoveries rather than exciting scientific events. Farmers digging fence posts have hit mammoth bones. Construction crews laying foundations have uncovered tusks. The remains of an enormous prehistoric creature show up in Nebraska soil with enough frequency that the state formalized the relationship by making it the official fossil through an act of legislature. Nebraska picked its state fossil the same way most states pick a flower, except the flower kept appearing in people's backyards uninvited. 56. Brownville, Nebraska was the site of the first telegraph line installed in the entire Nebraska territory in 1860, making this tiny river town one of the original nodes in the communication network that would eventually connect the American frontier. The telegraph line arrived in Brownville before most of the surrounding region had reliable roads, and before Nebraska was even a state. A small town that most Nebraskans today could not locate on a map without help was once a genuine communication hub through which news and messages traveled across the edge of the expanding American frontier in real time. 57. The Enola Gay. The aircraft that carried and dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima in 1945 was piloted by Paul Tibbets, who received significant portions of his military flight training at Nebraska's Kearney Army Airfield. And the most consequential single military flight in human history was piloted by a man whose skills were sharpened on Nebraska airfields. The state that sits in the geographic middle of America and gets credited for very little in military history has a direct and specific connection to the moment that ended World War II and fundamentally changed the nature of warfare for every nation on Earth permanently. 58. Willa Cather, one of America's most celebrated novelists and a winner of the Pulitzer Prize, grew up in Red Cloud, Nebraska, where the surrounding prairie landscape so thoroughly shaped her imagination that it became the foundation and recurring setting of her entire literary career. And the plains she walked as a child, the seasons she experienced, and the immigrant communities she observed in Nebraska fed directly into the novels that earned her a place among the greatest American writers of the 20th century. One of America's finest literary voices was built entirely out of experiences accumulated in a small Nebraska town most readers of her work cannot locate. 59. Nebraska's alfalfa hay production quietly feeds livestock operations in states that receive dramatically more agricultural recognition and media attention than Nebraska ever does, making the state an essential but invisible link in America's food supply chain. The beef that gets celebrated in Texas, the dairy that gets marketed from Wisconsin, and the lamb that appears on restaurant menus across the country is frequently eating Nebraska alfalfa before it arrives anywhere near a consumer. Nebraska feeds the animals that feed America and does it so efficiently and quietly that the states taking credit for the final product rarely acknowledge where the feed came from. 60. Nebraska maintains an official state road plan that includes Monowai the town, with exactly one resident, meaning government bureaucrats generate annual infrastructure reports and road maintenance schedules for a municipality whose entire population can be contacted with a single phone call. State transportation officials produce formal documentation for 4 streetlights and a road system serving one person who also happens to be the mayor and could theoretically just call the department herself. Nebraska's bureaucratic machinery keeps processing Monowai as a functioning municipality requiring full governmental attention, and nobody in the system has suggested that the paperwork might be slightly excessive given the circumstances. 61. An Easter Sunday morning in 1913 was supposed to be one of the most peaceful days of the year across Omaha, when a tornado tore through the city, killing 94 people, while many were still dressed in their church clothes heading home from morning services. Families who had spent the morning in prayer walked out of church doors directly into one of the deadliest tornado events in American history at that point in time. The storm hit on the single morning of the year when the maximum number of people were dressed up walking outside in large groups, completely unprepared for anything resembling a disaster. 62. The Ogallala Aquifer, sitting underneath Nebraska, contains so much fresh water that if every drop were brought to the surface simultaneously, it would cover the entire landmass of the United States under 1.5 feet of water. Nebraska is literally standing on top of one of the most extraordinary freshwater reserves ever discovered on the planet, and farmers have been pumping it out faster than it naturally refills for decades. Scientists have been raising alarms about the depletion rate for years while the irrigation systems keep running, and the water level underneath the state keeps quietly dropping inch by inch every season. 63. Omaha Steaks was founded in 1917 and essentially invented the American concept of shipping premium quality beef directly to a customer's front door, creating an entirely new category of retail food commerce that millions of Americans now consider completely normal. The idea that you could order a high-end steak from your living room and have it arrive frozen and ready to cook was a Nebraska invention that predated online shopping by about 8 decades. Seed Nebraska created the mail-order gourmet food industry before most of America had reliable telephone service, and somehow never gets credited for pioneering an entire retail category. 64. Nebraska City served as a major departure point for wagon trains heading out on the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and the Mormon Trail, and processed more emigrant traffic than many of the more famous jumping-off points that appear in every history textbook. Hundreds of thousands of pioneers loaded their wagons, restocked their supplies, and began their westward journeys from Nebraska City. And yet Independence, Missouri gets the romantic historical reputation, while Nebraska City sits largely uncredited in the footnotes. Nebraska City moved more wagon trains west than its historical reputation suggests, and history decided to celebrate a different city for doing roughly the same thing. 65. Nebraska is one of the only places in all of North America where fossils of the ancient three-toed horse can be found preserved in the soil, making it the evolutionary home of the direct ancestor of every horse alive on Earth today. The creature that eventually became the modern horse lived, died, and left its bones in Nebraska millions of years ago. Every thoroughbred racehorse, every working ranch horse, every animal that has carried humans across battlefields and prairies and deserts throughout human history traces its evolutionary lineage back through a creature whose remains keep turning up in Nebraska farmland between the corn rows. 66. St. Hastings, Nebraska is home to the only museum in the entire world dedicated exclusively to Kool-Aid, featuring original packaging from every era of the brand, complete with the Kool-Aid Man's own Hollywood-style handprints and footprints preserved in cement, and a fully operational Kool-Aid stand where visitors can drink the product at the location of its invention. A town of roughly 25,000 people in the middle of Nebraska built and maintains a museum entirely around a fruit-flavored powdered drink mix, and fills it with enough genuine artifacts and interactive elements that people make specific travel plans to visit it every single year. 67. Offutt Air Force Base, located just outside Omaha, serves as the permanent headquarters for United States Strategic Command, making it the nerve center that oversees and controls America's entire nuclear deterrence operation from the geographic middle of the country. The facility from which America would coordinate its nuclear response in the event of an attack sits in Nebraska, which means the most consequential military command center in the Western world operates out of a state that most Americans associate with agriculture and college football, rather than the management of civilization-ending weapon systems requiring constant around-the-clock attention. 68. Gerald Ford is the only person in American history to serve as President of the United States without having been elected to either the presidency or the vice presidency, and he spent his childhood years growing up in Omaha, Nebraska, before his family relocated to Michigan, where his political career eventually launched. The most powerful unelected president in the history of the Republic has Nebraska roots that almost nobody mentions when discussing his remarkable and constitutionally unprecedented path to the White House. Nebraska produced the man who held the highest office in America without winning a single national election, and the state gets essentially no part of that story. 69. Nebraska's Cornhusker State nickname, which now appears on license plates, tourism materials, and official state branding everywhere, was not officially adopted until 1945, meaning the state operated for 78 full years after achieving statehood in 1867, without having any official nickname at all. For nearly 8 decades, Nebraska was just Nebraska, with no catchy label, no marketing handle, and no shorthand identity beyond its own name. The state that now leans so heavily into corn as its defining cultural symbol spent the majority of its existence not officially acknowledging the corn connection in any formal capacity, which is a very Nebraska approach to branding. 70. Chief Crazy Horse, whose name appears on one of the largest mountain sculptures in human history and whose legacy fills volumes of American historical writing, was killed at Fort Robinson, Nebraska, making Nebraska the specific location where one of the most iconic figures in all of Native American history drew his last breath. The fort where this moment occurred still exists as a state historical park in Nebraska's Panhandle region. A state that rarely appears in conversations about Native American history contains within its borders the exact location where one of that history's most significant and painful chapters permanently closed on a September evening in 1877. 71. Nebraska is the only state in America where the official state song has been changed and debated and swapped out multiple times because Nebraskans genuinely could not agree on a single piece of music to represent themselves collectively. A state that cannot decide on one song despite having over a century to think about it, held official legislative debates about melody and lyrics, while actual governing was presumably also happening somewhere in the building. Nebraska picked a state bird, a state flower, and a state fossil without much drama. But the song question turned into a recurring identity crisis that the legislature kept revisiting like unfinished homework. Nebraska. One legislature. One woman running an entire town by herself. Shark teeth in cornfields. Fish falling from the sky. All of it sitting in the state everyone drives through without stopping. So tell us right now in the comments, what is the dumbest thing about your state that nobody talks about? If Nebraska surprised you, even once hit subscribe on Dumbest Things because we are just getting started.